One of the things I briefly mentioned, just it would be nice to elaborate on, is this term of monarchic republic. So we've been throwing around words like kingdom and republic and empire and monarchy. So what's a good applicable term to what this thing is,
Yes.
the East Roman Empire?
That's an excellent question, and I'm glad you flagged that, because we call it conventionally Byzantine Empire, and it's neither of those things really. We talked about Byzantine.
Yeah.
Now, empire is a bit of a problem because, first of all, there's no term in Greek, in the Greek that they use at this period, that corresponds to our notion of empire. It's not part of the official terms. They didn't even have a term for it. There's some terms that might mean something like state, archi maybe, or kratos. But for the most part, it's either vasilia, which we might translate as monarchy, or politia, which is polity. And politia in Greek, polity, is a Greek translation of Latin res publica.
Mm-hmm.
Res publica doesn't mean republic the way we mean it for the Romans, like a non-monarchical regime, right? That's how we mean like the American Republic, or, that's a usage that came in later, like during the Enlightenment. In Latin, a res publica is the common affairs, the common interest of a people who are constituted as a political community, regardless of the type of regime that they have. Like even Cicero could imagine the Roman res publica governed by a king or by a senate or by a democracy. And they continue to use that term. We don't use it according to Roman norms. We use it according to modern norms, the term republic. So they continue to call it a res publica or a polity under the emperors as well, right? And it was understood that the role of the emperor, whether he's Caesar or Vasilevs or in whatever language, was to serve the polity. I keep saying this. So the terms that occur in the sources most commonly are Vasilia of the Romans, polity of the Romans, or Romania, which is the proper name of this state, not empire.
Mm-hmm.
Now, empire. Empire in modern English, commonly, an empire is a state that's created when one group conquers a bunch of others and rules them. And it could be an ethnic group, it could be an ethno-religious group, it could be a political group, whatever, but there's an act of conquest and results in a state where one group is ruling over others. That's not how Romania is actually constituted. We've talked about this. It's, for the most part, all Roman citizens ruling themselves, like Roman subjects ruling themselves through their own government. So it's not an empire, strictly speaking. Now, occasionally, they will conquer other people. Like we talked about the warfare. Sometimes it's not just defensive, sometimes it's offensive, right? In that case, you do establish an imperial relationship. Like we, the Romans, are ruling over this other group. Could be Slavs, it could be Bulgarians for a while, it could be whatever. Or even some Muslims in northern Syria for a while in the 11th century. And you are not Romans. And that's an imperial relationship. The question is, how many of these imperial relationships do you need to decide that, well, we've reached a tipping point and now we're just going to call the whole thing an empire? Mm-hmm. Personally, I don't think we ever reach that point. I mean, all states, even today, have like minorities. Some of them are part of that state because they were conquered once upon a time. But we don't call those states empires necessarily. Even though, like, look at the United Kingdom. Well, Wales was conquered. And, the Welsh have their own identity, their own language. I don't know that you would call that now an imperial relationship. Maybe. I don't know.
I think there's also a synonymous use of the word empire that refers to the power that the state has in the global context geopolitically. So sometimes empire is used synonymously with superpower, meaning it's one of the primary nations in the world, and it doesn't necessarily have to do with the imperial nature of its history.
That's true.
Hence the sort of American empire, U.S. empire.
Yes. So you would never characterize the American political regime as an imperial one, insofar as it does not have an emperor, for example. But anyway, yes. The problem is that in my field, we use the term empire conventionally, even when what you just described is clearly not happening, like even toward the end. It's not a major world power. It has a few islands in the Peloponnese, but we call it empire and the emperor, and it's completely ridiculous. There's not even a term in their language for that sort of thing. Anyway, we can call things whatever we want, just so we understand what the reality is and what we are using those terms to mean. I think that's the important thing. Yeah.
So then let's look at words which are both fascinating. Monarchic, republic.
Right.
Why is that a good term for the East Roman Empire?
Because they understood it very much to be a polity in the Roman sense of a respublica that was governed by a regime that was monarchical.
So those two elements, there's a emperor dude at the top, and it's functioned politically like a republic.
Also, the emperor was expected to be working for the republic. Like, they keep saying this. So this was their conception. You don't find it, for example, in other kinds of dynastic empires, the ones that don't emerge from within the context of an ancient republic. So this is another reason why I find this civilization so fascinating. I mean, we mentioned the Greek and the Roman and the Christian elements that are kind of jostling together. This is fascinating to me in part because it's this weird combination of monarchical power, like in terms of executive institutions, and a republican kind of baseline ideology on which it operates. Yeah, and they sometimes come to a head.
Is there at all a degree to which it's a military dictatorship? Because especially when it's a general in the emperor's seat, yes, there's a republic, yes, there's political discussion, but the army has a lot of power. So to what degree is it a military dictatorship, as is sometimes talked about when you talk about the Roman Empire?
Yeah, so Augustus's position, for example, and that of his successors is talked about as a military dictatorship. In other words, when push comes to shove and the basis of political power is the army, then I suppose it's legitimate for historians to talk about a military dictatorship. But here's why I don't think the Eastern Roman Empire is a military dictatorship, even though, again, the emperors control the armies, and the armies themselves will often have a say in who becomes emperor, like through the civil wars that we mentioned. Okay. The reason why I don't think it's a military dictatorship is because they almost never, very, very, very rarely use the army as an instrument of social control.
Isn't that strange to you? Because you see that being done through so much of human history.
Yeah.
And the fact they don't resort to that. I mean, for 1,000 years, that's just not a thing.
As a way of keeping down the population, you just don't see it. And part of the reason for that is I don't think the population needs to be kept down. Like, this gets back to the consensus that we were talking about. The understanding is that the army is there to protect the Roman people and is often recruited among them. And for most of the period that I study lives among them. So when the emperors have to call up the army, they're literally calling up soldiers from local villages.
It's just incredible that this worked. I guess the Civil War thing as a mechanism is effective. Because you just, throughout human history, I mean, you look at even recent history, it's just a very common thing for an authoritarian figure to use the army to suppress people.
Yeah, but isn't that dangerous, though? Look at how many modern regimes tried to use their own armies against their people who were in a moment of rising up. Well, it's a risk, like the Arab Spring, especially in Egypt. And you could tell for those 3 weeks that Mubarak was trying to decide whether he could actually count on the army to suppress the protesters or not. Because you never know what they're going to do if you ask them to fire on a civilian population. It can backfire on you badly. So I think that is a very dangerous force to use, and even in the context of modern regimes, can result in a regime change.
No, absolutely. And there's huge wisdom behind that. But, leaders are not always wise, often not wise. And often maybe they start out wise, but power corrupts them over time. And so the fact that this does not happen just over and over and over and over And the East Roman Empire is there's just signal there that's fascinating. And I mean, this goes to the book that you want to be working on about why the thing lasts.
Yeah.
So
there's one emperor who does do that, and that's Justinian.